reason, but we will have to deal with that, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that would be so awesome, though. Um,
It's just saying an error occurred. I'm like, all right, well.
an error. Okay. Well, what you can share, for example, is the YouTube link, which
That's
I've
a good
just
idea.
put down there.
Yes.
Okay. So while you do that, I'm just going to welcome everybody back to episode 10 or whatever we are of Language Book Club with people who talk to you on the internet, and we're having such a great day. We're having so much fun, and this is our mystery guest
I'm a
has
mystery
been
guest.
revealed. Yes, our mystery guest is Gabriel Wyner, who is speaking to us from the West Coast USA, aren't you?
Yes, I'm in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. And
And
is that where you live now these days?
that is where I live nowadays, yes. I used to be in Vienna, but now I'm in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. And Gabe, so first of all, we are making these talks available later as well, so people can catch up with us. I have recently listened to your podcast that you conducted with Chris as part of my research and getting to know you before I talk to you. And I've obviously found that extremely interesting, and certainly there have been some questions about flashcards, so I'll bring those in before. But I've got a very good idea of who you are. But would you do me the honor, would you do us the honor and just introduce yourself to everybody?
My name is Gabe Wyner, as you said. Let's see. My background is in opera and engineering, just sort of an odd combo. I was an opera singer for basically 10 years and needed to learn languages for that. Needed to learn minimum French, German, and Italian. Russian was not a bad idea. And needed to somehow make up that gap in the fact that I was really kind of terrible at learning languages and had to learn them for my career. And so I, after a lot of fumbling, sort of navigated my way towards a method that worked for me, and then I started realizing worked for other people too. Wrote an article about that landed on Lifehacker, went crazy viral, and then started getting publisher offers. I was like, oh, crap. And then sold this book 2.5 years ago to Random House, spent a full year just doing research and writing the thing, and at this point my whole life is just language learning. It's developing tools for people to learn languages faster. It's sort of taken over my whole life. It's been pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm. So you've had to give up opera singing?
Honestly, I have not sung in a long time, and I'm okay with that. As it turns out, I kind of fell in love with writing as a just as an expressive medium that I didn't really realize. I sort of thought writing was like you write down the facts and people will know them. And through the course of doing, a book through a traditional publisher with a traditional editor who kicked my butt, I fell in love with the writing thing. And so at this point, singing has taken a little bit of a back seat. I will probably return to it at some point, but right now, in terms of implementing this, I did a Kickstarter back in 1 year ago, actually, a little bit more than 1 year ago, to develop pronunciation trainers in, at this point, 15 languages, sort of to go along with the book, and that went crazy. That went wild. I raised 10 times, almost 10 times more than I was intending to raise. Added 1 million stretch goals, and that's become my full-time job for the last year, and probably will continue to be my full-time job for the next year at least. It's the project just blew up, so that's my life at the moment.
Yeah, so you're serving the world in language learning, which is it sounds like you sort of lucky stumbled into it. It's fascinating.
It was a pretty weird road.
And because we're in a book club, tell us about Fluent Forever, which is I know I haven't read it yet. I will do though.
That's okay.
That's okay. But like I said, I listened to Chris talk to you about it, and so I know that you went through a very specific process as you went through writing this book.
Yes, Fluent Forever is basically it's looking into the science of memory, and it's trying to see how how does it? How can we look at what we know about how the human mind takes in information and retains it or loses it, and learn languages faster based on that information? I sort of, the start off point was this method that I had developed for using spaced repetition and combining that with full immersion, so there's no English in any of these flashcards, combining them with lots of pictures, this kind of thing, and trying to see why did that work so well. And because of the opportunity to basically sit down and research for a year, I got to figure out why the thing worked. And so the book kind of tells the story of how we learn and how best to take advantage of that. While writing it, I began learning Hungarian as a sort of test case, because Hungarian was not related to anything I had learned before. There were a lot of new sounds. All the words were new. There was just no connection to anything. And so I would write a chapter on learning sounds, and then I would learn Hungarian sounds, and then I'd write a chapter on learning words, and then I'd learn Hungarian words. And so I really got to do a nice test run while writing the book, which was a lot of fun. It's been.
I think that is extremely good to sort of use your book as a documentation of the actual process of how you're learning. Let me just check. We've got a little broadcast problem.
Okay.
And I don't want you to just tell me this stuff. I like hearing it, but you kind of want to. The other people should hear it too. So let me just check. What I'm going to do is I'm going to press stop broadcast and see if I can come back on. It might throw me out though.
Okay.
In which case I might. Actually, it's probably going to throw me out. So instead, okay. It says it's back. So basically, we have a lot of people now commenting on Facebook saying it's back, it's gone, it's back. It's back. It's gone. So yeah, we're back. Okay. So as I was listening to you on the actual Fluency podcast, I noticed something about the way that you spoke. Or you talked to Chris about the way that you teach sounds, because you focus very much on pronunciation and on sounds, and it's something I do when I start, because I teach German. When I start teaching people German one-to-one, one of the first things I start with is sort of, okay, so this is the CH. The CH sounds like this, h, but every now and then it sounds like this, sh. I try to get them to do the sounds. We look at some city name. We say Österreich, which is a good one because it's got an Ö in it as well. And we just go through that. But noticing you teaching, in particular, the Russian R was your example, to Chris, I really noticed that you have a very strong sense of, or at least perceivably, audibly, a very strong sense of self-confidence, and sort of that you are not silly if you're making a silly sound. Now, when a lot of adults first pick up a language, I feel that a lot of people feel really self-conscious. So my question really was, are you worried about what people think of you? Ever?
Ever? Am I ever worried about what people think of me? Absolutely. Gosh, when it comes to sounds, I don't feel like there's anything to be embarrassed about. I think that sounds are so, they're the meat of the language. I mean, I talk about this, sounds are the first thing I do. In terms of my method, I don't, like right now I'm about to start Japanese with my girlfriend, and we're doing it a little out of order because we're sort of playing around with kanji just because it's fun. But generally, the way I deal with the language is I deal with sounds before I even deal with words, before I deal with grammar, anything. It's just sounds, because that's your connecting point to a language. It's like we're talking about a medium that is done through your mouth. I mean, we're not just sitting here like telepathically sending each other signals. This is something that is going on in your lips, in your tongue, in your just lungs. And so I find sound sort of the best part of language. It's like it's so visceral. And the idea of, I'm going to go make this thing with my mouth, like the Icelandic fricative L, which is like my favorite sound. And all. They have this sound that is just where you let the sides of your tongue sort of wobble and make this sound. These sorts of things, I don't find them silly. I find them just amazing that people have come up with these ways of sort of flopping around the meat in your mouth and making words happen. And so the idea of being able to share that with people is, it feels like a privilege rather than something that's silly.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, do I ever feel self-conscious around people? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All the time.
It's it's fascinating to consider that you really have this focus on the sounds, and that's kind of where it's almost like where you throw your hook as you're climbing the wall of language learning. So you kind of hang it up on the sound, and to me, I often hang it up on vocabulary and where the vocabulary connects with what I already know. Because I really love looking at the words, and I'm the person who watches Borgen or Borgen, which I can't, you see, pronounce very well, but I watch it with subtitles and I go, that's a word from German, that's a word from English, that's a word from German. And it happens all the time. So I wonder if there is something, to starting in language learning, really starting where you look at somebody like Benny Lewis, who, extrovert, I want to talk, I really want to be able to use this very quickly. And it's almost like many people who have successfully learned a language, counting myself among them right now, don't know, but many people who have successfully learned foreign languages have picked a certain, you sort of start with where you're fascinated and you build from there. You have this really strong starting point. I wonder, because I wonder if sound works the same way for everybody.
I think there's two things going on. I think the thing you're identifying here is really important, which is that this is something that takes a long time and takes a lot of dedication. This isn't something that you can be like, I feel like learning a language today. Okay, I'm done. Like, it's something you need to continue for a very long time. And so if you don't love it, and if you don't love the process, and if you can't find something in there where you're like, oh, I found that he's saying a German word and he's saying an English word, where you can't find that connection, then you can't stick with it for the amount of time needed. It's not something that you can, I mean, you can force yourself into the gym because you decided I need to lose weight or I need to get stronger or something. And you can force yourself into the gym for a day or a week, but the idea of being able to force yourself in the gym every day for 6 months or for a year or for 2 years, not going to happen unless you find some joy in that, unless you realize, okay, when I'm running, yeah, it hurts, but I feel this thing where I just kind of, I feel like this is meditation for me, I feel like this is comfort for me. You get something. And so I think for you with the words thing, for Benny Lewis with this this ability to connect with people, these are the loves. These are the things that keep you connected to the language and can keep you interested in putting in the work. And so
and it's
yes,
almost like where it is in your heart, like where the language really, it sits with you.
Yes. I think that's absolutely true, and so that's a huge point, and it's a really important thing. I think where it comes with me with sounds is that yes, I think sounds are very important to me and are sort of this hook for me in terms of the love thing. But I think there's something else to it, which was an interesting thing to sort of delve into when researching the book, because I always thought sounds were so important, and I was always so angry at teachers. I was angry at going into I did a lot of the immersion programs at Middlebury, Vermont, and I remember going to the French school, and half of the school had really, really thick American accents, and I came in there with a good French accent, and I started losing it over the course of the school because I was influenced by all my colleagues, and I started going to the administration, being like, "Can I teach a diction class? Can I teach people how to pronounce French correctly?" And they kept telling me, no, it's mostly important for advanced students. And something I felt something really wrong about that. I was really upset about that. And in looking into the research of how we learn, I started realizing why, which is that if you can't hear the sounds in the language, and that is the first thing, can you hear it before you can even say it correctly? That's the first challenge that people often skip. They're like, can I get it? Can I make the Russian R correctly? Well, first you need to hear it. But if you can't hear it, you can't remember it. And so, for instance, if you're learning Hungarian and I say, okay, well, let's learn the word for camera today, fényképezőgép, it's gone already. and it's gone because you don't have the sounds in your ear. You can't actually grab onto each of the phonemes in that sound, and
Yeah,
so
and the
you
first
don't
thing you want to
remember
do
anything.
is sort of go, say that again, say it slow. I want
Yeah.
to, do this. So you really, you've got to make that happen, don't you?
Yes, and it's also, I mean, honestly, even just saying it slow, and I'm like, okay, well, we can keep saying it over and over again. Finkepe zugip, finkepe zugip, and we can keep doing this, and you'll still forget it tomorrow. And the reason you're going to forget it tomorrow is because there's so many new sounds in that word. This ny is weird. The e is actually, because of your German experience, going to be okay. The z is maybe going to be okay, except that you need to know the difference between a z and a z in Hungarian, because there's long and short.
Uh-huh,
There are
yeah.
all of these barriers to you even remembering a single word that if you take care of those barriers first, suddenly vocabulary becomes a lot easier to learn. And
Mm.
so I take sound as an efficiency thing, just aside from my love of it, and that's very helpful. Uh, if you take care of sound first, then vocabulary becomes a lot easier to remember, and that makes grammar much easier to remember later on.
As a second question that sort of occurred to me when I was listening to you and Chris, and you talked about the sound first, is that Becky, who I spoke to earlier, complimented me on my accent, that I have a good English accent for a German speaker, etc. Now, I've heard this, I've gotten a lot of comments on my accent throughout the years, and also spoke to a lady who has a very good accent in her German, and we sort of found, as we were talking to each other, we're both choral singers. We both were choir singers, and we thought about this. And choir singing teaches you to listen,
Yes.
to really listen, and this sort of reminded me of that. So I wonder if, and then obviously you have this strong musical experience and a strong musical leaning, and it really made me think, is there really something to that you've got a trained ear and it makes you a better pronouncer?
I think listening is key. I think one of the things that's nice about music is that you actually have to listen, and so you have to develop that skill. But I think that's a skill that anyone can develop. I think that a lot of people like to go into language learning with this belief that there are some people who are good at it and some people who are bad at it, and I think there are such things as individual talents and things that people are especially good at, something like that. But listening is something that people can learn to do. It's one of the things that this Kickstarter, this app project that is now taken over my life and will continue to take over my life, is an app designed to force you to listen. And it forces you to develop those skills that you've already learned in choir. And so, yes, I think that is a key thing. It's something that musicians really get an advantage at because they already have experience doing it. But I don't think it's something that's insurmountable for other people.
I agree with you. I agree with you because I think, I mean, I've always choir sung, but it's not. I don't have a natural musical talent or anything like that, and I never really realized. It took me so much longer to really. It took me maybe 5-6 years to understand when I'm singing the wrong thing, because you can hear when you actually start listening, you realize the vocal harmony is way off and you sound terrible. But it takes I felt like it takes actually a long time to get to that point where you've listened so much that you realize you're being awful.
Yes, I think it's very absolutely true.
Okay, there's a question from Yvonne, who is just following us, and just Yvonne, you're so awesome, brilliant. She's been very, very active. And okay, so she says, when can one say that he or she is fluent in a foreign language?
That's
What's
a
your
really good
fluency
one.
angle?
That's good. I think there's a real problem with the word fluent because it doesn't mean anything. It does mean something. We have this feel for what it means. It's this idea of, okay, I go in this cafe and I don't have to think in English and I don't have to struggle and I don't have to feel bad. I can just kind of order what I want. But there's a huge range between being able to sit in a cafe and order a coffee, which is sort of a fixed skill that you can learn the vocabulary for relatively easily. I mean, you're just like, okay, I need the words for coffee, I need the words for ordering, I need the sort of small grammatical pieces, and then I can do it. And being able to lecture on science at the Sorbonne. I mean, there's this range this giant range. And all of those things are fluent in some level for someone.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of dislike the word. I mean, it's in my title, and I dislike the word.
I'm the
me,
same. I'm cursing myself for calling my blog fluent sometimes.
It's tricky. It's tricky because people get really upset because people have such different definitions. I really like the European. I think it's CEFR, CEFL.
It's the Common European Framework for Reference or of Reference, so it's CFR.
I always think it should end in L because of language, and it's always R.
It's reference.
So the CEFR, that scale I really like because it's so standardized, and because you can take a test and it can tell you what you are, and because a C1 in German means something that is similar to a C1 in French or a C1 in Hungarian. So I very much like that system. For me, for my own personal needs, I find that I like the C levels. I like the C1 as a sort of, this is a good level of fluency. And I think a high B2 is kind of sitting around there too, where it's like, okay, well, I can kind of talk about the things I want to talk about. I can not think in English, or not think in my native language, as the case may be. And I can basically say the things I want to say and mostly understand the things that come in.
Yes.
Is that fluency? It's certainly not native fluency. It's certainly not that I can handle every situation that comes my way. I mean, I lived in Austria for a little more than 6 years. My German is good. I would consider myself absolutely fluent, but I certainly ran into a situation where I rented a rental car and then my gas tank cap fell off. And I didn't know Tankdeckel. I was just like, this thing, this is some gas. And they understood me, and I got my point across, but it's like I suddenly ran into a completely unfamiliar situation where I didn't have the vocabulary, but I could stumble my way through and get out. And so
that's how I define fluency for people. Usually, it's because I think of fluency back to, look, word nerd, right? I think of fluency in the sense of flow, right? So if you can keep a conversation or an interaction flowing without halting completely, no matter if you know the words, doesn't matter vocabulary, doesn't matter grammar, if you can keep understanding happening, then that's, in my eyes, that's fluent.
Yeah, and I think
so you could be fluent at like at a B1 or something like that.
I think that's true. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
I think, the only issue becomes with understanding. I think that at a B1, like right now where I'm at in Hungarian, I think is probably around a B1, and I'm starting to be able to basically say most of the things that are in my head, but I have large issues understanding other people. You know, my tutor, for instance, will bring up something, and I'll be like, "Whoa, you just used 3 words I don't know, so I have no idea what your sentence is about." And so that starts becoming I think the barrier towards fluency is you can hold up your part of the conversation, but you can't quite handle the other part. And that's
and so as soon as you have conversation breakdown, and actually CEFR mentions that as well, and a lot of the criteria for say Abitur, and I know about IELTS and TOEFL, so the English English proficiency tests, and equally the test after Goethe, they all will refer to this thing like that they kind of almost call communication breakdown. Just because we're throwing sort of B's and C's around, and A's, there are A's as well. And Yvonne says she doesn't really know, she's not familiar with CEFR. Stands for, I've Wikipedia'd it, Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So you're not wrong. And okay, so when you are, where are you at when you're in a C1? Gabe, do you want to take this one?
A C1. A C1 basically is enough street cred to not only get you into a college in Germany, for instance, if you have your C1 in German, but it's enough to teach. It's enough to allow you to teach in schools. It is enough that you can handle yourself on the street. You can go to shops. You can deal with those sorts of things.
Yeah. Even a B1 would be enough for that, hopefully.
That's true. Yes. But I mean, honestly, I did the Goethe Mittelstufeprüfung before I showed up in Austria, and so I had an official C1 certificate.
Mm.
And I showed up in Austria, and I went to a street seller, and he was speaking in dialect. And I asked him, can I purchase a basil plant? And he was like, sure, sure, here's this thing. And I'm like, how do you water this? And then 5-minute conversation where the only word I understood was Wasser, water. And I had to nod and be like, I missed everything you said. Thank you. Thank you. And that's at C1. And so there are absolutely breakdowns at all these levels.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
I would say a C1, you can basically handle yourself in sort of standard fixed situations, and you can
Yeah.
handle yourself in unexpected situations. And I think that's the big thing, is you can handle yourself when you don't have the vocabulary, where you run
And as
into.
a native German speaker, I can also say that I had a job last year where I had to, it's like a phone conduct service on a phone job, and I had to do a lot of calls to Switzerland and Austria. The
Sorry.
Austrians just about managed. Not easy. Not easy even for me.
Yeah.
And the Swiss, I had to tell them to use Schriftdeutsch or Hochdeutsch. So
Yes.
I had to tell them, can you clean up your German, because I don't understand what you're saying. And even then, they were really hard to understand. So
Yeah.
German is a language with very underestimated dialects.
I think that's true. And I think because of the spread of Hochdeutsch, I think when you look at something like Arabic, people, because there's no real standard that people speak a lot,
Mm-hmm.
people come into there already knowing, like, okay, there's going to be a dialect problem. But I think because so many people know Hochdeutsch, there's this sense of, oh, dialects aren't an issue, and then they become an issue.
They are crazy, aren't they? To me, it's just like, oh my god, because I can speak Moselfränkisch, and Moselfränkisch is essentially Luxembourgish. It is completely and utterly different. Chris has got a question for you,
Yes.
because he hasn't asked you enough yet.
No, more from Chris.
Yeah, come on, Chris. Okay, so if you had to write another book about language learning, what area would you say lacks the most focus for the community of language learners who want to become better learners?
Another book? I already wrote a book. I mean, I think my book as written is sort of does put the focus on the places I think that I want to focus on that I think are under-focused. In terms of the emphasis on sound and how important that is, that's kind of where I go first. In terms of really looking at memory and just looking at this as a problem to solve rather than this sort of vague language thing. How do I motivate myself enough to do language? Like, no, let's look at the machine here. Let's look at how the machine works and how I can make it work most efficiently. That's kind of how I want the focus to start shifting, or at least for that to be an available thing to look at. I think there's a lot of people learn in a lot of different ways, and there's certainly people who have gone to my book and being like, this is too problem solving for me. This is too technical, or maybe not technical, but too methodical. What people want is just, I want to run in there and talk. And it's like, well, okay, there are approaches for you there too. Honestly, I think Benny Lewis's thing of just running in and talking, I've done it. It's awesome. It works for certain people. My experience with German was going to the Middlebury programs that you linked in the common thread, and not knowing a word of German, and then signing a contract saying, I'm not going to speak anything except for German for 7 weeks.
Mm.
You learn very rapidly, and this is the sort of the Benny Lewis just get in there approach.
Yeah. And
it absolutely works.
There's something to, I mean, having written not a very, not the largest tome on memory, and I haven't really written memory. I've written a book about vocab learning based on what works for me, what works for other people. That's why it's called a cookbook, because it's meant to have recipes. In that sense, my fiance thought it was good, so I called it that.
That counts.
That counts, yeah.
Absolutely counts.
But from having written that, I certainly subscribe to, I think, what happens in your brain, the sensual, the emotional thing, and this is what you were talking about with flashcards as well, and I'll get to Ulysses' question because I think that touches on that too, is that if you are experiencing a word and learning it in the experience, you're going to remember it so much more easily. So, like, I remember Adjeszta very well. I don't know how well I've pronounced that, whatever. But I remember Adjeszta very, very well because I remember being in Moscow and it was really rainy and I was in a taxi and I sort of went, well, I sort of was trying to learn Russian writing, Cyrillic. So I just pretty much looked at whatever was written on houses, and there was one that kind of, and I was like, and then eventually got to Adjeszta, like sounding out every letter. Asked my taxi driver what it meant. And he said clothes, and I'm like, oh wow, now this house makes sense. I always remember that, and that's how I remember that word. I'm never going to forget that because I just won't. So Gabriel, Ulysses has a question that hopefully makes sense in that context. He says he followed how to set up Anki through your website by learning vocab from Anki, which, in case anybody doesn't know, it's like a online electronic flashcard machine thing. So by learning vocab from Anki through your explanation, I have learned many words in Spanish. I do find it really useful. I can use it in conversation, I can recall it fast, but my worry is that through the constant use of Anki and me learning new languages, I feel I will soon become overwhelmed. I won't be able to put the words in. I'll be stuck on a computer all day. And I realize you use it. I'm wondering how do you organize your Anki?
One of the nice things about Anki, and the nice things about spaced repetition in general, for those who don't know, the way these systems work is that usually with flashcards, you'll get a flashcard, it'll have, let's say, a picture of a cat on one side, and the other side will say something like koshka in Russian. Or, most people will use translations, and I have a big blah, blah, blah. We can talk about not using translations or whatever at some point during this talk. But let's say you have this flashcard, and you look at it on day one, and you say, okay, I see a picture of a cat. What is that called? I don't remember. Look at it. Koshka. Okay. And then you go through other flashcards, and you come back, and you see this picture of a cat, and you're like, that's the koshka. Great. You got your cat. What usually happens with flashcards is that you have your pile of cards that you use for whatever, the test tomorrow. This is usually for last-minute cramming or something like that. And so you look at those cards, or let's say your test is in a week, and you look at those cards every day. And so tomorrow you look at the card, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's koshka, and you put it away. And then the next day you look at it, and you're like, koshka, I know this one, next day. And every time your card is really, really easy, you're not getting very much. The flashcards are useful in the proportion to which they are challenging. And so if you have a very, very easy time, then this little test you did is helpful, but not very helpful for getting it into your memory. And so what most people do is they use their flashcards every day, and then they stop. And what spaced repetition does instead is it shows you this koshka card on day one, and then it says, okay, well, if you can handle it now, let's see if you can handle it in 4 days. And you wait 4 days, and you see, okay, this is a picture of a cat, and now I haven't thought about it for a while, and I think, koshka. Check it, it's right. And the program says, okay, if you can handle it for 4 days, what about 7? If you can handle it 7, what about 12? And then what about 20, and what about 35? And it keeps pushing koshka away further and further and further. And what that means is that you spend less and less and less time learning each word. And so what I've found is that if I keep learning, let's say 20 new flashcards a day, let's say 30 new flashcards a day, which is generally the rate that I recommend people do. If you're doing 30 flashcards a day, the very first day, that's going to take you 5 minutes. It's not going to take you very long. Especially, it's a really important thing for me that you make all of your own flashcards. That's the learning experience for me. Is when I'm making my flashcards, I'm learning it. When I'm reviewing my flashcards, I'm just reviewing what I did already. I'm ingraining those memories that I've already built. I'm not building new memories with flashcards.
Yeah, that's similar to the vocab cookbook has, like I said, very little prescriptiveness, but it has a structure that just goes, you acquire, then you memorize, and then you review.
Yes,
and making a flashcard is the memorizing bit, isn't it?
Well, it's the combining the acquiring and memorizing bit. I think that it's the point where you're building the memory. You're saying, okay, what are the parts of the memory that I want in my head? Let's collect all of them. Let's put them in one place. I've now seen them all in one place. Click the button. Now I have flashcards, and then those can bring back those memories.
Yeah. And there's a specific technique that you have for flashcards. Is it a step by step?
Yes. What I look at in terms of words are that the idea of a word and a translation is very, very small in terms of how much of an impact that makes in your memory. You know, that Hund is dog is not very interesting to my brain, and so it's going to forget it very easily. But that if I look on, for instance, Google Images, this is a thing I really, really push. If you search for Hund on Google Images, you're going to find different images than if you search for dog on Google Images. You'll find that Germans have a different sense of what a dog looks like, actually what a Hund looks like, compared with what English speakers think. And so you start looking for those differences, and you start saying, okay, well, how is Hund different than what I expect to see? Search on Google Images, you see it immediately. You see some small difference. You grab that image, you put that on your flashcard. Now I have some sense of what the word means as a new concept, not as an old one. You
I
get these
remember that.
Go,
I
sorry.
remember you used Dievuchka and girl.
Yes, it's
And
my favorite example.
that's
It's right.
you mentioned that in Fluency Made Achievable, in the interview I did with you, and that fascinated me for ages because you're so right. So Dievuchka is girl in Russian, but
Yeah.
it's not a little girl, is it?
No, it's Девушка is well, Девочка is little girl and only little girl, and Девушка is sex object for the most part. I mean, I've been corrected. I keep getting emails every once in a while from Russians being like, "That's not quite true. Like, we don't use it only for sex object." You look on Google, it's mostly sex object, and so that doesn't mean that that's what the word means. It means that at least in terms of the media, in terms of internet websites, that's often how it's used, and that is really different from how girl is used in English. And so in
Yes.
the aggregate, in terms of just seeing what comes out of the data, you start seeing these tendencies. Does that mean that's the only thing the word means? No. But honestly, from a language learning standpoint, it doesn't matter. If you're seeing just a small part of the picture and that part of the picture is interesting enough for you to remember it, then now that's in your head. And then later you can talk about Девушка and someone's like, well, that's not just sex object, and now you've learned something extra, something new. Instead of just being like, oh, Девушка, girl, it's basically the same thing, which is totally uninteresting and totally not memorable.
So it's about the richness.
Yes, it's about can you develop a word that has 1,000 connections instead of just one. I mean, when I say dog in English, it has every little dog I've seen in my life is connected to that word. And when I say, you know, if I'm starting to learn, Japanese right now, and I think Inu is dog. I'm pretty sure. Inu has no connections for me. Inu has one connection in my head, which is that Inu and dog, I think, are the same thing. But when I don't think, when I see a dog, when I see a little like I don't know, Japanese-looking dog, I don't even know what a Japanese-looking dog looks like
No.
yet.
Japanese lady holding a little dog.
Could be. I don't know. I don't know what Inu looks like. And so that word isn't going to really stick in my head and really bloom and have life to it until I start doing this building process of saying, what does this look like in Japanese? What does this sound like in Japanese? What character does it use in Japanese? What is the kanji for this word? This whole, what words does it relate to? How do I say tail? How do I say cat? How do I say animal in Japanese? How do I connect those parts together? When that network starts forming, where I have associations between Inu and all of the little parts that make Inu an actual word instead of just some thing that's related to English, like that's the Japanese word for dog. That's when that word is worth memorizing. That's when that word has a chance of sticking in my head, and that's when a flashcard, once I've assembled all that information onto this one card, or onto these probably 5 or 6 cards for Inu, at that point, those flashcards will stimulate that much of a memory. And so that, I think, that's sort of the learning process that I'm looking at is how do I make Inu as rich as possible?
Yeah.
And then how do I remind myself that I did that?
That's a very good process, and it's the idea. It explains the idea in the taxi. It explains the Google image searches. It's really it makes sense out of memorize and the way that they try to have you associate it. It really pulls it all together very well. It's about not just remembering word is word, but remembering, I don't know, big ball of meaning.
Stop.
Yeah.
um, I didn't actually answer the question. The question was, doesn't this get overwhelming when you start learning 30 new cards a day? What
Mm.
happens 4 months down the road? Do you start having to deal with 4 hours of flashcard use? And the nice thing about spaced repetition, because the intervals get bigger and bigger and bigger, and because the next time I'm going to see the word mochka, cat in Hungarian, is in 3 years if I were to continue doing this. Like that's the current interval is 3 years. Um, it means that the cards that are already in your head basically vanish. I mean, the amount of
Mhm.
time I'm spending keeping mochka in my head, cat in Hungarian,
Yeah.
is now basically zero. And
Mhm.
so in the beginning, you start spending maybe 5 minutes on your 30 cards. By week one, now you're spending 25 minutes on those cards. By week
Mhm.
two, you're spending 30 minutes on those cards. And then week three is still 30 minutes. Week four is still 30 minutes. 2 months down the road, it's still 30 minutes to learn 30 cards a day. And so I've been learning Hungarian very slowly. I've been taking it at somewhere at a rate of 15 to 25 new flashcards a day for the last 2 years. I've sort of intentionally taken Hungarian as slowly as I can, skipped days when I'm busy, just sort of taken it as a very real life example of what happens when you're busy and don't have time to be like, I'm going to do an hour of language every day. Uh, and for one, I've learned that it works, that you can actually learn languages in a very, very short span every
Mm.
day.
How long
And
do 15, 20 new cards take you?
uh, I would say the sort of saturation point in terms of getting all the old cards back and then learning the new ones. If I'm very consistent, actually now I bumped it up to 20, 25. It's about 25 to 30 minutes.
Mm,
If
that
I
is
was,
doable, isn't it?
yeah, it's something you can handle. Like you have to
Mm.
also make those flashcards, which takes about the same amount of time. If I the real rule of thumb I use is that 30 flashcards is 30 minutes of
Yeah.
review a day and 30 minutes of card creation a day if you want to maintain
Okay,
that habit.
moving away from flashcards, first
Yes.
I will get to Talitha's question, but one little question for you, if there's any way of answering this quickly-ish. Um, what else do you do besides flashcards? Because otherwise you just have a load of words, right?
It's not all words. The flashcards for instance, at this stage in Hungarian, all my flashcards are sentences. They're all fill-in-the-blank
Good,
sentences.
yeah, that
Yeah,
makes
it's all.
sense.
Yeah, I do words for a very, very short amount of time, where it's just straight picture to word. But I get out of there as soon as I can. Usually, the sort of process is I spend 2 to 4 weeks on sounds, making flashcards to sort of build my ear. I would say 1 to 3 months, depending on the language. Japanese is going to take a long time because of the kanji. But ignoring Japanese, because it's a crazy special case, I think. For a language like French or something, I'm going to spend 1 to 2 months really just doing picture, word, sound, uh, and personal connection of like, well,
Yeah,
what does sha, cat mean to me? Like, who is the sha in my life?
yeah.
Frisky. This
And
I
then you
try to
move
find.
on to sentences.
Then it's all sentences. It's only sentences. I go straight to a grammar book and I start taking in sentences and taking every
Okay.
little bit of them and making those into flashcards.
Okay,
So
so there is grammar book and stuff because if you focus so hard, I don't want. Well, if you have the method of learning a language exclusively through Anki, let me know. But I was just wondering, really, like how does he connect them all? So it's good to hear that you do actually connect, or not good to hear, but to me it's just like, oh, that makes more sense.
Anki
I
is the hammer I'm using, but generally I need resources from whatever I can get. And so I take
Yeah,
sentences from Google Images, I take sentences from my grammar book, I take sentences from my tutor. I mean, right
yeah.
now I'm taking 2 hours of tutoring with Hungarian every week. The only goal of that tutoring is let's chat for an entire hour during this session and let's write down everything that's new that we talk about, every sentence that's new, and all of those sentences go into the flashcards so that I basically retain everything we talked about during that hour.
Oh my God, you sound like a dream student.
I don't.
From a tutor's perspective, I'm just like, la.
Well, it means you don't have to go over things twice, and I don't waste time as a student being like, can you correct me 30 times on this grammar thing I'm making? Like,
Yeah,
no, correct me once, I'll make a flashcard, I won't make that mistake again.
that's a really important message to anyone who does hire a tutor. You still got to do the work. Sorry, we can't teach you a
Absolutely.
language. You still got to do it yourself. We're just here to, you know, push and revise, but you still got to do it. Right.
Yeah.
So Talitha's question that I will not overlook. She says we sort of touched on it a little bit with choral singing and listening. So as someone who loves singing and languages, something I'm interested in is the connection between language and music. Did the fact that you were singing in the language help you learn it?
I think the fact, yes. Short answer is yes. Longer answer. There have been studies talking about how musicians learn languages faster. There have not been, I haven't read a lot explaining why. In terms of theories, things that I can just guess.
Yeah, speculation.
Speculation. We're just talking about speculation here. I think the listening thing you talked about earlier in terms of choral singing is a huge thing. I think even if you're a violinist in an orchestra, you're still being trained to listen. You're still being trained to care about what something sounds like. And I think that gives you an advantage. I think that music generally does train your brain. It makes you think in different ways. I think there have been also studies talking about how music makes you better at math, makes you better at a lot of things. In many of the same ways that language learning makes you better at math and makes you better at problem solving and creativity. And so I think exercising your brain in that way makes your brain work more flexibly.
That's a very good sort of headline as well.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Use your brain.
Use your brain. It'll keep going better. I mean, I think
more better brain.
More brain, more better. I think the listening thing is probably the most direct thing. In my own experience with opera, I mean, I had a very direct advantage in that before I started French, I had taken a half semester of French diction. And I had sung an opera in French and had coaches explain why my French was crappy and how to make it better. So, huge advantage coming into that language. I showed up at that language having already taken care of the pronunciation issue, and which made all of my words easier to remember, which made me more understandable. When I showed up in Middlebury and had my first interview to figure out my entry level, my accent made it sound like I was like I was basically fluent. And that made that stepped the conversation up. That made the conversation be more challenging, which is good for me because I was getting more interesting, more varied input, which made me go faster. And so I think with the very specific example of, does being an opera singer make you better at learning languages? Well, that one's kind of direct because, yes, you're taking classes that make you better at languages. You're taking classes that make you listen to the sound of the language directly, which is where I tell people to start, but which is where a few people do start.
Yeah, so musicians listen. And
yes.
To be honest, language speakers should listen. You've got to. That's why, listening to a language is, listening to a language, listening to the radio, etc. But really listen, pause, and reproduce. That's a different kind of listen, and that's intense.
Yeah.
So that's a really good one. Right, I've got time for one more question, so I'll just read this out to you. It's from Sam Lawson. He says, first of all, compliment to you. Hi, Gabe. It's interesting that you said earlier that some people may find your book too methodical. For me, it's the first book I've read that's been so specific about method. A lot of language learning materials seem to be very vague. For me, that's no good. Sam, just from a fellow author, we don't want to be too prescriptive. We're all really scared, sorry. But he says, I need something definite and tangible that I can follow. I'm trying to learn Italian. I'm spending a lot of time on the sounds. I'm having real trouble reproducing the alveolar trill. Have you got any tips? First of all, what is an alveolar? I can produce a single alveolar tap and also a trill using the back of my tongue. But I'm having real trouble getting a trill with the tip of my tongue.
I love this
Gabe,
person.
what on earth? So, hello, phonics nerds. Have fun.
This actually I covered in Chris's thing. This was the Prince of Prussia thing. The alveolar trill is rrr. It's the Russian one. Yeah, it's not the back one. It's not the German. Rrr. It's the front. Rrr,
that's not even a German. It's like a Bavarian one, isn't it?
The rrr? I mean, which one?
Well, anyway, we're getting sidetracked. So back to the alveolar.
The alveolar trill is the front one. It's with your tongue behind your front teeth, where you say D. And the basic, it will take time. It's just a pain in the butt sound to learn how to produce. the sort of ingredients that you need are you need to know what's happening. You need to be able to hear it, which most people can hear it pretty quickly. But you should be able to hear the difference between, for instance, r and r. You should be able to hear where it is in your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
R is front, r is in back, for instance.
Yeah. All I can do is back, I think.
That's,
or that German thing where we kind of go h.
Yeah, that's there. And so the front one is where you do d, 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 d.
Mm-hmm.
And so first you need to be able to hear it. Second part, you need to know physically what is happening, which is that your tongue's coming up where you say D. It is rigid in the back, in the root of the tongue, so it's holding it in that position. But the front is floppy enough for it to sort of vibrate against that ridge behind your teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just information that you should have. Hey, that's
I feel Italian.
This is cool. And then the other thing is just it starts becoming, can you find some word that tricks you into making the sound? And then can you just practice it until it sticks? And the best set of words that I found so far, and maybe people will send me stuff and I'll be like, wow, that's even better, is to think the words Prince of Prussia, Prince of Prussia, Prince of Prussia, to say the phrase Prince of Prussia, stick D's instead of the R's in there. So it's going to stick your tongue in the right place. And then sort of start playing mind games with yourself, going, okay, I'm going to say Prince of Prussia and think Prince of Prussia. Prince of Prussia, Prince of Prussia, Prince of Prussia. And if you can get that tap, this guy says you can do the tap, which is just one.
Prussia. There you go.
There you go. If you can get the tap, which is just the one, Prince, Prince, then if you can get two taps, Prince, Prince. And if you can get two, then you can get three eventually. Then it's just a practice thing.
Yes. Fantastic. That is the answer that we all wanted to hear about the alveolar trill.
Yes, nice.
Fabulous. It's excellent. Oh God, we learned something here. And I have a student who, in a lot of lessons, and we do video chat. He's in Boston, and he's great. This is just again just like when a learner does this. This is fancy. What he does is he will watch me, and I will say to him, okay, no, your tongue has to do this, and he'll actually watch my mouth doing it, which really can help with pronunciation a lot. So if you, Sam, if you know somebody who can do the alveolar trill, try and watch them. Or I mean, you can watch videos where people do it as well, with a close-up of the mouth, and it can help.
Yeah.
I might be talking nonsense though.
What was that?
It might not be true. I don't know. I know one person where it's worked.
No. I think being able to have visual feedback and I think what that does is it lets you have a better, more visceral understanding of what does it look like for you to be doing it right, and that helps. That's that same information of the tongue should be up here and the root should be hard and the front should be floppy. Like that's getting a more visceral sense of the exact same information.
Exactly. So really, it's a case of like. And this is the interesting bit about sound to me, is working out what should my mouth be doing, and where should the sound come from, and it's teaching people is really difficult in that same sense, because it's like it's kind of like the chew, but it's not. It comes from much deeper, and you very quickly start becoming this sort of trying to have these physical descriptions of what your body's doing. It's hilarious. Right, I'm sorry. I have to call time on our wonderful chat.
That's okay.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. This is the first time we've actually talked face to face.
I know.
We've had email contact, so hi.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. I just wanted to say that in German, and I realized no one ever would say that in Germany. So it freut mich.
Yeah, it's freut mich auch.
Okay, so. If you want to hang around to announce your giveaway in the thread and pick your winner and sort of let them know that they're a winner, that would be awesome. Sure. And just generally participate. And I'm moving on to our last participant, our last video chat person, which is a gentleman from Northern England, which is where I live. So he's actually neighbour. In the wider sense of the word, but at least a fellow Brit, a fellow Northerner, who has written a novel. That's Aidan O'Rourke, so stay tuned for that.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
Gabriel. Bye.
Bye.